America needs its citizens to be virtuous. But what exactly does that mean? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. I'm sure if you ask people, do you think it's important for people, for individuals to be virtuous? Everybody would say yes, of course. I want people to have virtues. I want people to have good, solid morals. I want the moral compass of our entire nation to be on the path of righteousness. And I want people to be truthful and so forth and so on and so forth and so on. But when you ask specifically about virtues, do you understand what that means? Do you understand what the word means? And I think it's really important if you're telling people that they should be something, that you should all be on board with what the definition of that something they should be means. And before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at washingtontimes.com, and of course, wherever podcasts are available. If you do go to Washington Times to check out my Bold and Blunts, then be sure and sign up for my newsletter. Just go to the newsletter section. All you have to do is enter your email address, and you will get delivered right to your email box Monday, Wednesday, and Friday the commentaries that I write at the Washington Times, as well as my Bold and Blunt podcasts that generally come out Tuesdays and Thursdays. You won't want to miss the upcoming Bold and Blunt interviews, as well as my commentaries at the Washington Times, because I am poised to go on a 3-week trip to Israel, part of a couple different delegations, and then 10 days of independent reporting there about what's going on in Israel, what's going on with Gaza, how the war is progressing, helping you sift through the truths versus myths narratives that you may be hearing in, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post, you know, the corporate media types, the left-leaning media outlets that like to draw moral equivalencies between the Jewish people and the radical nut job terrorists. So you want to be sure and subscribe to Bold and Blunt for that specific reason. And one more quick mention, you can get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are available. So back to virtues, right? Somebody says to you, we need more virtues in this nation. What does that mean? Well, coincidentally enough, I was doing a little research for this podcast, and in January of 2013, yes, I know this is going back a ways, but I find it interesting anyhow, and it addresses this point. Gallup conducted this survey, and their results were headlined this way: Americans consider individual freedoms nation's top virtue. And I find that interesting because I wonder if freedom is actually a virtue, or is it more like a characteristic? Is it more like an outcome? Well, let's look into this a little bit more. Minority of young adults, Gallup writes, see U.S. government system as superior. I agree with that, right? All good, all good. But is that a virtue? So out of Princeton, New Jersey, okay, Gallup reports this: Americans consider individual freedoms, the quality of life, and the opportunity for people to get ahead to be the United States' standout virtues relative to other modern industrialized nations, with majorities rating the U.S. the best or above average in each area. At the same time, fewer than half of Americans consider the U.S. ahead of most countries when it comes to the nation's economic and healthcare systems, as well as its system of government. So, you know, you can sift through that. You can parse through and debate this and that. For instance, our healthcare system, when you compare it to other nations, you know, go back before Obamacare, go back in time, decades ago, America's healthcare system was the best in the world, right? Because it was based largely on a free market type model. And It was based on individuals taking responsibility for their own healthcare costs, and everybody just accepted that as that's what you do in a free society. You don't expect government to take care of you from cradle to grave. And then came all the Democrats, and then came all the Marxists in the Democrat Party, and then came Barack Obama and Obamacare and all the push for government-funded health care. And health care is a human right, which you can say access to health care could be considered a human right, but does that mean that taxpayer-funded access to health care should be a human right? If health care applies, well, then why not food? Why not housing? You have a right to housing. You have a right to food. But do you have a right for other people to have to pay for that because you're too lazy, or for whatever reason you decide not to work and make enough money to pay for yourself? Anyhow, I digress, right? Back to this Gallup survey, how the U.S. compares with other modern industrialized nations. America comes in first, according to Gallup, when it comes to individual freedoms. They are the best, say 77% in this survey. They are only average, say 16%, and they are the worst or below average, say 8%. Who are these 8%? I mean, seriously. Individual freedoms, America is the worst. That 8% right there represents the most ignorant of ignorant. Just total knee-jerk hatred of individualism, of conservatism, of conservative principles that talk about limits on government. 8% say America's the worst for individual freedom. Unbelievable. Anyhow, moving on. Quality of life. 65% say that America offers the best in terms of quality of life. 26% say only average. And once again, 8% say below average. Remember, these are virtues. These are what Gallup is describing as virtue. So virtue number 3 is posed as the opportunity for people to get ahead. How does America fare in comparison with other modern industrialized nations? 55% say America is the best. 29% say America's average. 16% say America is the worst or below average. There are 3 more so-called virtues that were rated here by Gallup. Let me just run them down very quickly. The system of government. America's system of government is deemed a virtue by Gallup. Keep that in mind as we go forward in this discussion. 46% of Americans say, or 46% of Gallup poll participants say America offers the best virtue called system of government. 34% say it's average. 21% say America is the worst or below average. Another virtue, another rated virtue here, the economic system in America. 34% say America's the best. 41% say America's average. And 24% say America's the worst or below average. One more so-called virtue. The healthcare system. 29% say America's got the best. 33% say America is average. And 38% say America is either below average or the worst in comparison with other modern industrialized nations. What is more interesting as the takeaway here? Those by themselves, those bullet points by themselves are interesting enough, right? How Americans view various quality of life standards, various quality of life ratings in America. So those by themselves are interesting enough. But again, that goes back to 2013. So that if you look at it that way, those are a little outdated in terms of responses. But what I was saying is what is more interesting and pertinent to today's Bold and Blunt discussion is the fact that these quality of life standards are deemed virtues because it goes to that word, that definition. What is a virtue? If you ask people, should you be virtuous? Do we need more virtuous people? Everybody would say yes, but what does that mean? So according to Gallup, virtue is a very broad definition. It can mean quality of life. It can mean standard of living. It can mean freedom. It can mean the level of freedom. And I think my guest might have a different viewpoint on that. His name is David Hein, and he has written the book Teaching the Virtues, which is a book unlike anything else out there. If you want to pick up a copy now, you'd be doing yourself a favor because it's really a book that stands on its own. There aren't like a dozen different books on teaching virtues. So this is a book that you want to add to your collection. But what's interesting is if you're going to teach the virtues, right, like my guest David Hein does, then you all need to be on the same field when it comes to defining what virtue is. So let's start there. David Hein, I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is great to have you here.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's great to be here.
I'm very excited to talk about your book. I actually have a copy of it right in front of me. It's called Teaching the Virtues, and it's something that I think is so missing from America's culture. Talk to me a little bit about why we need virtues in society.
Well, I think we need the virtues, especially we need the ancient virtues. I think it's very important for people to know what virtue means. When I teach a class on ethics and leadership or almost anything else, I always ask students on the first day what virtue means, and they generally think of it as values. They'll often use the word values, whereas as Gertrude Himmelfarb and others have pointed out, that word tends to point to something that is subjective, relativistic, and so on, and that's really not what virtue means. The ancient virtues really start with the 7 key virtues, the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, courage, and temperance, and the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And these virtues are as necessary today as they were 2,400 years ago. John Adams said that private virtue is the foundation of public virtue, and public virtue is the foundation of the republic. And as you know, Edmund Burke said that if we don't govern ourselves, others are going to govern us for us, and we're not going to like that. So we know that temperance, self-discipline, self-mastery is essential for freedom. They just go together, ordered liberty.
Right, because only those who are capable of self-governance, right,
That's right,
don't need government. They don't need government to tell them how to behave, and that's what keeps our nation free and our government small, supposedly. It's not working so well lately, though, is it? How come? What do you see going on?
No, it isn't, but I look at that in relation to schools. I'm very much involved with the world of schools, especially secondary schools. And I just know that if students are living in a culture, a school culture, that enables them to leave their laptops lying around, for example, or their jewelry in a dorm room, they can really focus on what the school is all about. And a lot of what I am concerned with in this book is really focused on the basic educational strategy of noticing and naming. There are all sorts of activities in ordinary life that involve the virtues, but we don't think of the virtues. But as some philosophers have pointed out, like Philip Lafoot, the virtues are essential to life, just as an oak tree has various purposes. The purposes of an oak tree are survival and propagation. And in order to accomplish those good ends, the oak tree must have deep roots. If it has the shallow roots of a creeping vine, it's not going to be able to survive when a big wind comes along. And similarly in our lives, in order for students really to focus on the task at hand, which is to have good relationships, to focus on their studies, and to flourish in an academic environment, they need to live in a culture of virtue. And what I try to do in this book is to show how all sorts of apparently non-moral activities, like writing a paper, has all sorts of virtues attended upon. I mean, you as an excellent writer, you know how much the virtues of self-discipline, prudence, fortitude, and so on are ingredient within writing. And our whole culture needs this. I mean, both political parties. You can see this in the sense of honor. For example, after the debacle of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, no one took any responsibility. I mean, we know this. People were just shameless with regard to gaslighting, deflecting, passing the blame, and so on. And we didn't see any resignations as a result of this. And clearly, it really came down to a point of honor. No one was taking responsibility. So we need to recover virtue at the level of both public virtue and private virtue. And that's what this book is all about. I mean, eventually we need to move from a situation that John Henry Newman talks about, which is just giving notional assent to virtue. I just gave a series of 7 chapel talks out at St. James School in Hagerstown, Maryland. And the students nod their assent, but then I need to move, as Newman says, from notional assent to real assent, where it becomes part of their heart, mind, and will. And that's a much heavier lift. That's harder to do.
So there's a couple points that I want to expand upon that you just mentioned. But before I get to that, I can hear the passion in your voice about this topic. And could you just sort of run down, just take a couple minutes, and what was in your mind when you decided to write this book? Why did you see the need for it? How did your research go? Just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I am not a perfect person myself. I'm not a paragon of virtue. And as I look back on my own life, frankly, I've seen how much I would have benefited if in high school and I went to a good school. It was an Episcopal school in Maryland. I can see how much I would have benefited from a much more systematic, focused, intentional concentration on those 7 key virtues, plus several other ones, such as gratitude, patience, and generosity, kindness, honesty. And I look at various incidents in my life. I mean, I really think my first lesson in practical philosophy or applied ethics was all the way back when I was in 4th grade. And those of us who were on the 4th grade football team, which is all the boys in the class, were a little bit apprehensive just before our first interscholastic game, which was against the Calvert School in Baltimore. And by the time we were ready to play the game, we were picturing these Calvert players as big and strapping and strong and basically semi-professional football players. And so we were might apprehensive. But the coach, Coach Tulai, said to us the day before, now, boys, courage does not mean not being afraid. It means going forward and getting the job done in spite of your fear, in spite of your anxiety. And I really took that to heart. I thought that was fascinating. And I realized now that what would have been a trite saying to a 19-year-old was revelatory and also a big relief to a 9-year-old. But what Tulai was doing, and I kept in touch with him, we became good friends for the next 50 years or so, what he was really doing was teaching the virtues in a very straightforward, honest way in the midst of our ordinary activities. And so I came to realize, partly as a result of an article that I published in the Imaginative Conservative called Writing as a Moral Act, that Jeff Nelson at the Kirk Center picked up on, I started to realize that teaching the virtues may begin at sort of the top of a pyramid with direct instruction via the teacher. And as you know, there have been books recently on Mirrors for Princes and great literature. Russell Kirk said the way to teach the virtues is through literature, not so much through rules and precepts. And all of that is good, but you really need to start at the top with direct instruction by teachers, indicating what virtue is and what the virtues are. Then you need to move through, as you move through the pyramid toward where the students are, you need to move through exemplars, literature, history, and so on. But then you need to move to their ordinary occupations, all the things they're involved with in the day. And that's where the virtues really come in. And that's when students take on more and more responsibility. So eventually, we need to move to a position where they're noticing and naming the virtues and living them in their own lives. So as I've come to see this, I kind of arrived at all this accidentally by just thinking about writing and all the virtues that were ingredient within good writing. I came to see that there's a much more direct and powerful way to teach the virtues than what we've been doing. And, this has been a problem that's existed for 2,400 years. Plato addressed this situation in the Protagoras when he asked, what is virtue? And he identified virtue with knowledge and said it can be taught. But then he wrote the Meno, in which Socrates says, wow, I agree that virtue is knowledge and can be taught, but I look around, I don't see much teaching and learning going on. And I think that suggests that it's a very, very difficult thing. I mean, if you think about it, teaching the virtues means that you're teaching, first of all. And what teach means is help students to learn. Some students are rebellious, intractable, lazy, grade grubbing, and so on. And so there needs to be the virtue of docilitas, which is teachability, first of all. And nobody can really give that. Also, I think one of the reasons why the public schools have failed, frankly, that's where 90% of the teaching goes on, is that for 125 years, they've been pushing values education, but in a very thin moral culture. And various scholars like James Davis and Hunter have pointed out that you need a framework of meaning that gives thick normative meanings. So I think that in a sense, piety is the most important virtue because it's the orienting virtues. All the virtues need to square up to a center of value, to God, in effect. And if you don't have that, then you're not going to have effective virtue teaching. I mean, we see in, for example, Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, that the main communist character in there, Rubashov, has virtues. He has trust and loyalty and duty and self-sacrifice and faith. He's got all those. But in fact, he's a terrible person supporting a regime that ruined the lives of tens of millions of people. And so he has the virtues, but they're all directed toward the God that failed. And that's a horrible situation. That's what we want to avoid. We can't have a thin moral culture with no transcendence above and no foundation beneath. We need a thick moral culture in order to teach the virtues.
That's an interesting point you just made about the communist, because I actually was thinking as you were talking that maybe one way to frame the teaching of virtues would be to put it in the question form of, would you like to be an exceptional human being? Would you like to be somebody who is unordinary, out of the ordinary? And because in this culture, that's what stands out, people who are virtuous, right? But then you make the case about the communists, so that kind of that obliterates that thought. Really what you're saying is it's very difficult to have the proper virtues without belief in God. That's my takeaway.
Yes, that's right. On your point about exceptional, that's a very interesting point because I have a whole chapter in this book, which most people would not think to include in a book on teaching the virtues, but it's all about honor. And honor is a very interesting idea. One problem with it in our schools is that students subscribe their names to a document affirming the honor code when they start the year, and then their teachers indicate to them what the different rules are with regard to the honor system when they take a test or when they do a homework assignment and so on. But there's nothing in between that. There's no discussion of the fact, and it is a fact, that all four of the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, courage, and temperance, are very much in play in respect of the students attempting to abide by the honor code. And not only that, but even faith and love are very much in play, because if a student feels some sense of receiving value from an institution, such as the University of Virginia and its great honor code, which is where I was. I was on the honor committee. If a student feels as if the student's receiving value from this sort of object of relative faith, the university, and is privileged to be there, then the student will be loyal in turn. And that environment, that culture of honor, that community of trust, will lift that student a little higher than where the student would have been out in society. And so, yes, the student does need to claim virtues and standards of obedience to the honor code, which really comprises so many virtues, needs to do that in contradistinction to society at large, needs to allow that culture to pull him or her a little higher than where he or she would have been otherwise in ordinary culture. And so, yes, all of this, the virtues, they really do point to be a little technical, deontological ethics, where you're bound to obey various principles, and they are the opposite of a rank utilitarian system such as Rubishov and Darkness to Noon abides by, where it's just a matter of the greatest good of the greatest number, and society, or number one in the dictatorship, determine what the greatest good is. Even if, and everything, truth, life, honor, you can see in that book, are all relative to the center of value, which is the dialectical process in history.
So let me go back to what I wanted to expand upon a couple minutes ago. And then you brought it up again. You were talking about the virtue of writing. And it gives rise to a good example of really the wall that the society faces in terms of bringing back virtues into society. When you consider writing, right, and students writing papers in school, what about artificial intelligence now that writes their papers for them? So this is just one of those walls that as a culture, as a country, we have to overcome. Don't you think that in certain instances it'll be insurmountable for us to bring back virtues into this society?
Well, that's a great question. I've been involved in some conversations about this. For example, schools will allow students to use AI to be what they call a research partner. And what that means is that they allow students to go to AI and ask AI what would be a topic to write about for this paper. Now, I've been a teacher for 40 plus years, and I know that, and also like you, I've been a writer. And as you know darn well, 50% of the game is figuring out, using your imagination to figure out a good topic that's just right for this outlet, for this audience. And it's very, very hard. It's one of the things that makes writing so arduous. And to just cede that power and that struggle to AI, I think is all wrong. And that's even a legitimate use of AI. I mean, clearly, from what I've gathered from teachers, is the students are going way beyond the official boundaries of AI. To answer your question, though, I think that after giving this some thought, and there's been a lot of discussion of using AI as an effective tool, I think the only way to confront AI is within a small community of, say, a couple hundred students, or perhaps a few thousand, such as the University of Virginia, and have a very strict honor code, and let students know that the purpose of this education is not to get you high grades or not to get you into law school or medical school, even though you might think that. The purpose is to teach you some things worth knowing. And you are bound by honor and by the virtues to comport yourself in a certain way. And you will know when you cross that stage to receive your diploma whether or not you acted shamefully or with honor, with integrity, and it'll make all the difference. So I don't know any way around it except by pointing out, and for students really to grasp, the fact that to live a life of excellence, which comprises the virtues, is better than living any other kind of life. That it really, in order to achieve your full potential as a human being, it requires virtue. It's just essential. And at some point, people have to either accept that or reject it. But I'm not sure that there's much of any other way around the huge problem of AI.
This has been such a fascinating discussion. I can't believe the time's up already. But David, I love your book, Teaching the Virtues. I guess you can get it anywhere books are available, yes?
Yes, or order it directly from kirkcenter.org in McCoster House, but it's available, at all the online publishers. Cheryl, this is just a great topic, isn't it? I mean, just fascinating.
It is. You could talk about it for hours, I know.
And I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your commitment to this. You do a lot of good, but it's necessary. We are facing an uphill battle, and so I really appreciate your helping to get the word out.
Well, I appreciate you writing this book because it actually helps me when I do my daily coverage at the Washington Times. I refer to this book sometimes, so it's great to have on hand. Teaching the Virtues, David Hein. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thanks, Cheryl.
It really is a one-of-a-kind book, so, you should check it out. You should go pick up a copy, read through it. use it as sort of a moral compass as you walk through your day-to-day. I want to thank you for listening. Remind you, you can get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are available, at WashingtonTimes.com, of course, where you can also subscribe to my Bold and Blunt newsletter. It comes out, as I mentioned earlier, 3 times a week. And in addition to picking up your copy of Teaching the Virtues, pick up a copy as well of my latest nonfiction, God-Given or Bust, Defeating Marxism and Saving America with Biblical Truths. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time. In the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.